Welcome to Capernaum, in Hebrew, Kfar Nahum, the village of Nahum. Now, who's that Nahum? I don't know. No one knows. But Capernaum, Kfar Nahum, is the city of Jesus during his ministry in the Galilee. This is the center of his activities. This is where he comes from and where he gets back to at the end. Why? Well, Capernaum is situated on the border between the territory of Philip, the son of King Herod, and his brother Herod Antipas, who holds the western parts of the country, in the north, of course. Now, it is also situated near the main road leading to Damascus, like other sites we're going to see later in our course, in our tour. It is also a city that is named or titled a polis, a city in Greek, in the New Testament. And according to the Gospels, there's also a centurion, a Roman officer in charge of 100 people, at least theoretically, who resides here in Capernaum. So this is a major city in the region of the Galilee, next to the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum. Jesus resides here, as I said, and he spends some time performing miracles, preaching in the synagogue, and also visiting the houses of his disciples. There are actually 5 disciples, 5 apostles later, who live in Capernaum. Peter and Andrew, John and James, and also Matthew. So 5 of them live in Capernaum, which is a fisherman's village and also perhaps a center of commerce, being on the border between the territories of Antipas and Philip. Behind me, you can see the houses of Capernaum, at least some of them. Actually, the village or the city is quite big. Actually, it goes beyond the wall over there. And if you look over there, you can see there's a red dome. That part belongs to the Greek Orthodox Church. This part belongs to the Catholic Church, but it's all the same village or the same city. Capernaum, the village of Nahum, is actually the same city, starting here and going over there. So it's a big city, and these are the houses, and you can see that they're built of basalt stone, black basalt stone, typical to the area. But not everything is made of basalt. Because right over there, to my right, there's a beautiful facade of a large building, and that's made of limestone, white in color, protruding, looking over the entire neighborhood. Why is it this way? What we're going to explore is this, as this is the synagogue of Capernaum, but we'll start by going to the church of Capernaum, which is right here to my left. Follow me. In the 20th century, this building was built on top of the excavations below. It looks like a flying saucer flying over the ancient remains. Why was this church built here? Because of these remains. They are unique. Let me tell you what we can see right here, immediately to my right. Well, actually, this is part of the original village of Capernaum from the time of Jesus. To be precise, even from the Hellenistic era. That's the 2nd century, 1st century BCE. But it continued to be a dwelling also in the time of Jesus and later on. So at the core of these excavations, what we can hardly see in the middle is a typical house from the time of Jesus. That house served as a dwelling, just like any other house in the neighborhood here. However, sometime later, perhaps already in the 1st century AD, this house stopped being used as a house. It is no longer a dwelling. it served another purpose. What was that purpose? We don't know, but we can tell you that people don't live in it. There's no kitchen, there's no vessels inside. It looks like it is frozen in time. Around it, people still living their lives. But in the middle, something odd happens. Slightly later, we don't know exactly when, that house was extended and its walls were replastered. On the plaster, we find something interesting. Graffiti, inscriptions. One of these graffiti says, Lord, God, Kyrie eleison, God have mercy on us. Amen, Peter. What does that mean? Well, it means that sometime after the 1st century, perhaps already in the late Roman era, this site was actually converted into a place of gathering for Christians. Such a place of gathering is not yet a church. The earliest churches will appear in the 4th century, with the rise of Christianity as a state religion during the 4th century. This is too early. We believe it was used as a domus ecclesiae. In Latin, domus means a house. Ecclesia, community. Domus ecclesiae refers to the house of the community. It's a gathering place for the community, performing rites, praying together perhaps eating meals together. It's the predecessor of the Christian church. It's a rare phenomenon. In this country we have only this example of a domus ecclesiae. There's another early church in Megiddo, but that's not a domus ecclesiae. There's another example in Dura Europus in Syria. So it is quite rare. So a domus ecclesiae here. By the 5th century, another phase begins. Now it's Christians, it's the Byzantine Empire. And in those days, a church is built around the main core of the finds here. This church is an octagonal church. When we see octagonal churches, we know precisely what it is. It's a commemorative site. It means that in the Byzantine period, they believed that there was something of importance inside. It is not a basilica. It is a holy site people come to venerate in. What was that? What was the significance of this place for the Byzantines? Well, I can tell you. Because travelers coming to the Holy Land, Christians who visit Capernaum, they tell us that they saw in Capernaum the house of Peter. So what do we have here? We have a commemorative church from the Byzantine era, commemorating the house of Peter. Underneath it, there's an earlier domus ecclesiae, perhaps around a house which may have been the house of Peter. Can we really say this is the house of Peter? No, we can't, unfortunately. Science can't help us with that. Is it possible? Yes, definitely. Is it even probable? I believe so. Because if the domus ecclesiae is indeed from the end of the 1st century, that's a couple of decades after the death of Jesus and the death of Peter. People probably still remembered where this site was, where the house of Peter used to be. So it makes sense. What happened in the house of Peter? You can't see too much of it now, so let's look back at the neighborhood behind my back, around the palm tree. Now, the New Testament tells us that Jesus performs many miracles in Capernaum. Jesus, for instance, heals the mother-in-law of Peter. He heals the daughter of the head of the synagogue, Jairus. And many, many other miracles are performed here in Capernaum. But in one case, according to the Gospel of Mark, and I'm reading from Mark chapter 3, verse 31. It says that Jesus is preaching in one of the houses, and suddenly, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Now these verses are quite amazing. Think about it. What does Jesus say in these verses? He says that he basically establishes a new notion of the community of believers. It's a new sociological, religious concept of the community of believers as one big family. It is the birth of the concept of the church, of the ecclesia. And it seems fascinating, I believe, that if our interpretation of the archaeological remains is indeed correct, then exactly on the same site where Jesus declares the creation of the ecclesia, of the community of believers as the new family, we find one of the first domus ecclesiae, houses of the community in Christendom. And perhaps it's right before our eyes. This is the synagogue of Capernaum. The synagogue of Capernaum is mentioned also in the Gospels. It is said in the Gospel of John, in chapter 6, that Jesus goes to the synagogue and he preaches in the synagogue. There's a long sermon in there. Let me quote a little section of that long and interesting and difficult to understand sermon. In chapter 6, verse 32 in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said to them, to the people in the synagogue, "I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." It is a sermon focusing on the concept of bread, but not just any bread, but the true bread, the bread that gives life. In these words, Jesus refers to himself as the true bread, as the spiritual gift that God gives humanity. In a sense, this is the code to decipher the significance of the Last Supper in Jerusalem right before the crucifixion. So this site has a strong tie with the final story of the Gospels. So the synagogue looks nice. It is impressive, divided into 3 halls by 2 rows of pillars here. There's another row of pillars over there. And the facade is quite impressive. When you look at it, there are 2 things that strike you immediately. Firstly, the fact that everything here is in white limestone, unlike the neighborhood around. And the second thing is that the architecture is actually typical Roman architecture, say 2nd, 3rd centuries. If you look at the pillars, for instance, you can clearly see that each pillar is made of a raised platform, the base, the pillar itself. This is not the actual height of the pillar, and then the capital on top. So the style is late Roman, and that led many scholars to believe that this is one of the earliest synagogues in the country. But recent excavations has shown that the site is actually much, much later. There are Byzantine structures underneath. It means that this synagogue is probably from the 5th century AD and not as early as we believed. Regardless, it has nothing to do with the time of Jesus. It's definitely not a synagogue from the Second Temple period. Yet, it is located in the city of Jesus. It is located in Capernaum. So it may come as a bit of a disappointment to learn that this structure is not from the time of Jesus. But not all is lost. Let me take you out and show you something which may perhaps be connected to the time of Jesus. We're looking at the facade of the synagogue now. This is the main entrance, and there are several interesting facts about the archaeology and the location that I'd like to draw your attention to. Firstly, if you look at the facade at the wall, you see something interesting. It's a flat wall here. It's a flat wall here, yet in here we have something protruding a little bit, a few centimeters out, with a nice carved basis. Now, if you don't see that well, look over here and you'll be able to see it even better. Here's another one. Look at the fine line here, the base here. It looks like a column, like a pillar, only it is engaged into the wall. We call these pilasters in archaeology. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to it is because this looks to me like an imitation of the architecture of one of the most famous buildings or areas in the entire world in the Second Temple period. And I'm referring to the Temple Mount built by King Herod. Around the Temple Mount, there were 4 walls: the Western Wall, the Southern Wall, the Eastern Wall, the Northern Wall. And these walls were adorned. We know that because we have found them by these pilasters, these engaged pillars. So when a synagogue from the Byzantine era has the same architecture, it makes me suspicious. Is it accidental just because the Romans used the same technique in other places too? Or was it an intentional creation that was supposed to reflect the ideal of the temple? Indeed, in Jewish spiritualism in the ancient times, in the Byzantine Roman period, a synagogue is a replacement of the destroyed temple. So why not express it in architecture? It makes sense. In addition, we can clearly see the decorations up there on the lintel. And if you look closely enough, you can see that there's a nice palm tree over here and another palm tree over there. Palm trees, as we will see in Magdala, palm trees are a symbol very well known in the archaeology of the Second Temple period. It is the symbol of the kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem is, where the temple is. So I suspect that these palm trees are not accidental. They are here for a reason, to reflect the inner ties, the links between Jews living in Capernaum and the destroyed city of Jerusalem and its temple. So the architecture looks like the architecture you'd expect in temples and monumental buildings in the Roman period, not in the 5th century. And however, this is a building from the 5th century, not from the early Roman period or late Roman period. How can we explain the gap between the architecture and the dating of the building? Some suggest that this building, which is built here in the 5th century, was built by using or transferring parts of earlier monumental synagogues from other places into this location. It's in secondary use, and that would explain two things. It would explain the architecture, which doesn't fit the date. It would also explain the fact that this synagogue stands here, shining in the sun, blindingly white, whilst the entire village is in black, in basalt stone, which is typical to the site. Makes sense. Others suggest that maybe what we've got here is totally different. Maybe this isn't really a functioning synagogue in the Byzantine period. Maybe this synagogue was transferred here totally. All its components were transferred here from another location, not by Jews, but rather by Christians. Why would they do such a thing? Well, Christians read the Bible, and they read the story about Jesus in Capernaum. Now, Capernaum in the 5th century is under Christian control. It's in the Byzantine era. So they're looking for the synagogue. Maybe there were no signs of the synagogue at that time. However, they found a solution, and they brought another building to this location so that pilgrims coming to the holy site, looking for the synagogue of Jesus, could see a real synagogue. Well, I don't really buy this, I'm sorry to say. It was suggested by scholars, but I think it goes, it's too much. I don't think the Byzantines would invest in such, would be involved in such an effort to create a pilgrimage site. But then again, it is a possibility. Now the question remains. It is agreed that the synagogue as we see it now is not from the time of Jesus. It is definitely later than the time of Jesus. Whether late Roman or Byzantine, that may be disputed, but it's definitely not from his time. Isn't there anything we can associate in this building with the time of Jesus? Perhaps there is. And it's not too far. It's right here around the corner. Let me show it to you. All right, we're looking at the outer wall of the synagogue from the Byzantine era. And if you look carefully, you can see that the outer wall is white. It has the typical pilasters adorning the wall on the outside. But when you dig a bit deeper, you see another wall. And that wall is built in basalt stone, black basalt stones. What is this wall? Well, some suggest that these are simply the foundations. The basalt stone is stronger, more formidable. You'd like to have a formidable infrastructure, so that's what you do. But there's another possibility. Maybe these basalt stones are the remains of an earlier structure, perhaps even from the Second Temple period. And if so, it is plausible to assume that before the Byzantine era synagogue, there was here an earlier synagogue maybe even from the time of Jesus. Can we prove it? No, unfortunately we can't. But as I said, it is a possibility. Maybe the synagogue of Jesus, the synagogue where Jesus acted and performed a miracle, several miracles, maybe this is that wall. I'm standing now next to a long row of objects, of architectural fragments found at or near the synagogue. They are part of the magnificent decorations of that synagogue. You can imagine all these sections. They belong mostly to the area of the roof. You can imagine how the synagogue would have looked like for visitors in the Byzantine era. Some of the finds here are quite interesting, again, reflecting the common architecture in the Roman world. For instance, this beautiful cornice over here, which has this typical decoration that archaeologists call eggs and darts. You see, the eggs are the round features there, and the darts, or heads of spears, are in between. So there's an egg and a dart, an egg and a dart, and it goes on to the left. In addition, we also have a nice dedicatory inscription. Someone who donated money to the synagogue would leave his mark, his inscription, over this pillar. At the top of some of the pillars, we have the menorah, such as this one. But we will discuss the menorah when we get to Magdala. But one of the great riddles in the synagogue is this stone in front of me. Take a close look at the right-hand part of the stone, of this decoration, and you can clearly see a nice structure with pillars, the Ionic-style pillars. There are two wooden doors on the right-hand side, and there's a half dome, a conch-like half dome on top of the pillars. It looks like a Roman temple, perhaps. But wait a second. Don't go there, because if you look carefully below the pillars, you can clearly see there are two wheels. So this is not a building. It's a structure, it's an object on wheels. What could it be? When it was found, scholars suggested that this structure was perhaps the Ark of the Scrolls. Let me explain. In every Jewish synagogue today, where you go to the synagogue, you see the Ark of the Torah Scrolls. This is an ark in which you have the Torah Scrolls, the books of Moses, the Bible, and there are the Torah Scrolls. They take it out and they read the Torah on Mondays, Thursdays, and on Shabbat. So in many synagogues that were excavated, no such Ark of the Torah Scroll was found. So archaeologists started asking themselves, where were the Torah Scrolls kept? And when this stone was found, they thought, it was probably inside a portable structure on wheels, so you could basically move it from one side to another. It makes sense, okay. So it's a movable Torah Scroll. But why would someone depict a feature in the synagogue, in the architecture of the synagogue? You can see it for yourself. Why have it on the architecture? So maybe there's something else behind it. Indeed, in excavations conducted in later years, many more synagogues were found. And suddenly, in some of them, such as in Chorazim, or in El-Qanatir in the Golan, we have the synagogue and we have a structure, not on wheels, a fixed structure, which is interpreted as the Ark of the Torah Scroll, next to the opening of the synagogue, usually facing Jerusalem. So if there was a fixed structure for the Torah scrolls in the synagogue, that perhaps should be interpreted in a new way. Maybe it isn't the Ark of the Torah scroll. Maybe what you see here is the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was the ark in which Moses kept the 2 tablets in the desert during the journeys of the people of Israel in the desert until they entered the land of Canaan. Eventually, it was brought to the temple of King Solomon. It makes sense, therefore, that this is a depiction of the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of the temple. It would make sense to have a depiction of such a symbol in the synagogue. This is something which does not exist in the synagogue. It disappeared, probably already in the First Temple period, before the destruction of the Temple of King Solomon. If we interpret it this way, it makes sense that we have a depiction of something holy from the Temple of Solomon, including, in addition, the menorah, the holy menorah, the candelabrum inside the temple. 2 objects belonging to the temple. Again, bringing us back to the concept of the Jewish synagogue as a replacement, a temporary replacement for the temple. So we've seen in Capernaum many things. Some of them go back to the time of Jesus and even earlier than that. But unfortunately, the most impressive parts here, the synagogue and its architecture, belong to a later period, to the Byzantine era. The synagogue here, what we see at least, is not from the time of Jesus, unless the black basalt wall belongs to an earlier synagogue, which is an option. So, how did a synagogue in the time of Jesus look like? What were Jews doing in a synagogue in the time of Jesus? Were they praying, for instance? Well, the answer is quite complicated and interesting. To answer that, I'd like to take you now to another place. It's called Magdala, or Migdal, where a synagogue from the Second Temple period still stands today. Let's go.